a few people, some familiar names. Peter has joined us. Hello, Peter.
There's a lot of familiar names there.
Yes, I'm just searching. Yes, my colleagues from my university as well, which is really nice. The topic is really valuable, to a person like me teaching business English and business communication. That is really valuable. Good practices is something that we should follow at this difficult time of pandemic. Yes, because where are the good practices? Yes, there are so
this is
many.
it,
Yes, and everybody
yes.
brags that
And
there's.
do we agree? Do we agree with what good practice is? Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
We can't hear the participants, can we? They can't speak.
They can't speak, they can only write in the chat box.
Yeah.
Rob will be observing us.
Rob is there. Hi, Anya.
The big brother. I still need to talk to Rob because Rob promised to have a webinar for us some time ago. I hope he can hear me, but so far he has not done it. So I will be watching him for the webinar. All right. Okay, so since everybody is in, I will very briefly, not to take too much time, I will very briefly remind everybody who you are. Most of people don't need to be reminded of these obvious facts, but just for the people who have joined us for the first time, maybe. Evan is a freelance English language teaching professional, and he specializes in business English and English for specific purposes. He is based right now in Germany, but he travels virtually, probably recently, all around the world. Yes, that's the way we travel. And I would like to say that very briefly that there are four main areas of Evan's expertise: consulting for multinational companies, writing materials, and with reference to this, he has written over 20 books, and you can find them on his website. You have the link to this website in the invitation and Evan's profile. Also, teacher training, very broadly understood, and intercultural and communication training. And today, a very valuable topic, as I have already said, for all of us teaching business English and business communication, giving us guidelines to materials concerning teaching business English. So what we know about good practices and how to use these good practices to search successfully through the bulk of all kinds of materials. Over to you, Evan.
Thank you very much, Lucina. It's very nice to be back with IATEFL Poland. So many friends, so many familiar faces. Look, I've even got my IATEFL Poland badge on. You see,
wow,
webinar,
that is really...
So there you are. So now I feel at home. Yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is business English materials. Where are we now? And basically, this is a talk about course books, published materials, and it's really a talk about what we've been doing with business English, what the thinking, some of the thinking behind the scenes is, some of the thinking the researchers have about business English, and then to see if published materials are meeting what we know about business English, as it were. If you'd like a copy of these slides, they'll be at my website, but I know this event is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording as well later. Now, a few years ago, Steve Flinders wrote that course books, business English course books, looking for a business English course book was like going to the supermarket. You have to hunt around. There's a lot on the shelves, a lot of different products on the shelves. You have to hunt around, but eventually you might find something that fits what you want, that's really tasty for your needs. And we're starting, that's the starting point we're looking at, this idea that you could just go and look for any course book you want. And this comes really from this survey review. ELT Journal publishes, every few years, publishes a survey review of business English materials. This has been going on for years and years and years. And Steve Flinders did the last one a few years ago. And I was asked a couple of years ago to do the more current one. And what this is basically a discussion about the latest 5-10 years of business English materials, where we are with business English materials, and then it's a look at various course books. So I've picked several course books to look at in a little bit more detail. We're not going to be talking about those course books here. What we're going to be talking about is the background to how to evaluate published course books. But it's all available on my website, so you can just go in and download the survey review and have a look at it. It's a lot more detailed than what we're going to spend the next hour doing. But here's a question for you. If you can just quickly put in chat, do you use any course books, yes or no? And if you do, maybe you can remember one or two of the names of the course books. It's not a test, it's just an interesting thing to see. There's the business, market leader. Business partner, yep. In company. The business, yes. These are all the standard big multinational, international course books that we all know and love over the last few years. This talk is not a anti-textbook talk by any means, nor is it a pro-textbook talk. It's just an examination of where we are. And I should say that having written several course books myself, I'm not against course books. I think they have the right, they have a position in our industry. They have a position in our profession, and they're very, very useful for many people. Right, so there are lots and lots of types of course books. This is how I broke it down in the article. So I said there are general course books, and those are basically what people have just written: business, result, in company, and so on, market leader, business partner. Then there are lots of supplementary materials which focus on a very specific area, maybe negotiating or presenting. There are course books, some people call them ESP books, which are much more focused on industries, maybe financial English or marketing English and so on. Books which prepare people for tests, of course, and then other things which you could group as resource books, so what's left over basically. And that's lots and lots of different things which we can put together as a useful resource to bring into the classroom. Now, for the purposes of this survey, once I started looking at this, I only actually looked at general business English course books. I looked at a couple of the others, but there's so many out there, and it's just such a big job. I even decided only to stay to level B1-ish in the course books, because otherwise it would have just exploded. So the research I did was basically around a set number of big, well-known course books. And the outline of the talk today is really in 3, maybe 4 parts. First, I'll go over some of the research on where people who are looking at this stuff in detail think good practice. What do we mean by good practice in business English teaching today? A lot of this will be very familiar to people. You may take 1 or 2 ideas away with you. You may come across and say, well, no, I disagree completely. That's fine. I'll be just covering some of what the researchers are finding across the world in terms of what is good practice in business English teaching. We'll finish that bit off then with a very short checklist of key criteria for looking at course books. And then I'll go through some of the discrepancies, some of the issues I found when I did my survey, where I think we're not quite, or course books or publishers are not quite meeting where the research says we should be meeting, where practitioners say we should be meeting. And then we'll finish off with a very brief comment on where we are now and maybe a little bit of where we're going. So let's think a little bit about good practice in business English teaching today. And of course, you know, the room is full of experienced people. We'll all have our own opinions about this. I'm starting off using this book, this Catherine Nickerson and Plankin book, which came out a couple of years ago. I'm sure most of the people in the audience are familiar with this. And they defined business English as this umbrella term, which is very, very often used to define business English. Any interaction, written or spoken, that takes place in English. Okay, but the point is that it's where the purpose of that interaction is to conduct business. So they see business English as the language you need to conduct business, not the language you need to read about business or talk about business, the language you need to conduct business. And as we'll see as we get into this a little bit more later, this is actually quite a significant perspective if you start thinking about what it is we've got to put in our course books and what we're doing on our business English courses. And when you go into the book, you see there's a whole range of current topics, what is business English and so on. I'm sure, as I said, most people here are familiar with this book, but some of the stuff here is actually quite recent research and quite new. For example, chapter 9 on intertextuality and interdiscursivity, which hasn't been around in certainly amongst most business English teachers very much, and you don't hear business English teachers talking about these things very much, and yet in the research world this has been seen and discussed for a number of years. And intertextuality is this idea that texts, spoken or written, don't turn up in the real world on their own. So you would never find an email which comes in out of the blue and nothing happens. It's normally referring to another email or referring to a telephone conversation, referring to a project, it's not a standalone object. And so all these texts in spoken or written in business English tend to be intermeshed in some way with other texts, other media, other resources. And what the researchers are saying here is that it's quite important to try and replicate some of this in our training. And I'll give you a quick example just to say what I mean. When I looked at some of the email writing books, very briefly in the survey, there are basically two options. There are books which are full of phrases, of useful phrases for email writing, very, very popular books, and how to write, how to start a paragraph, and how to do this and how to do this. But they are totally out of context. And then there's another approach of email writing and teaching email writing, which is about saying, okay, listen to this telephone conversation. Now look at these two emails. Which of these emails came from the telephone conversation? How would you see the problem? What is the main issue? How would you answer this email? And so on and so on. So one is out of context in a sense, and one is in context. And what the researchers are saying is that we should be thinking more and more about this using texts, not so much out of context as if they come from the blue, as if this phrase is always the best way to start an email, and this phrase or these three phrases are always the best way, because it totally depends on who you write. There are thousands of ways to write emails. There's no correct or incorrect. It's just what is correct for a certain situation. So that's one of the things research have been saying more recently. If you go into the book in more detail, there's actually a whole chapter on business English teaching materials. So there is a lot of work being done on this already for us as practitioners to look at. And this is the sort of thing they've discussed. This is the summary of it from that chapter. And some of the things which Nicholson and Plankin think we should be thinking about in business English materials. We should be talking about authentic spoken and written English, and this word authentic comes up everywhere. Huge arguments about what we mean as authentic. And I'm not going to go into that debate now. There's plenty of literature about it. But suffice it to say that when publishers use the word authentic, they mean something quite different to what you may think of as a practitioner or somebody who's done a master's degree in English. Authentic may, for some people, mean it comes from outside the teaching world and just is brought in. So a newspaper article written for the real world is brought into the classroom, and that's an authentic piece of material. But other people would argue, no, it's not authentic unless the people who are reading it and using it are reading it and using it in an authentic way. So if you read an article looking for certain items of lexis, then that's not perhaps an authentic way. Or is it an article which they themselves have chosen because they're interested in it, or has it been given to them, and so on. So there are many, many levels of authenticity. So part of this authentic stuff has to do with the tasks we use in the classroom. How close to the real world are the tasks which we ask people to do in the class, or are they very far away? And I think this probably has something to do with the level we're using as well. They talk about the different genres. We'll be talking about genre later. It's a very key principle at the moment, simulating real business situations, recreating workplace contexts. Here's this intertextuality, interdiscursivity, and multimodality, which of course is all about the different modes of communication we've got. And then there's the skills, the soft skills, the intercultural communication skills, and so on, which we're all familiar with. So this alone, this list is actually quite complex, and we could spend an hour talking about each and every one of those individual items. What's interesting, of course, is that very often people argue that yes, this is all very well if you're in a company, but if you're in a university or if you're working with pre-experienced people, this doesn't really count. Well, of course, it does count. Our job is to bring the real world into the classroom if we're working with pre-experienced people. It's just done in a slightly different way. Maybe it's not as specific as with corporate clients, say, who we know and work with every day. There are other books. I'm not going to go into this one in the same detail. Here's another one which came out a couple of years ago. Again, it's Nickerson, but working in a team, Nickerson and Plankin with Ilya. But this is much more looking at it in terms of discourse rather than in terms of business English. So the language of getting the job done. And here they've interviewed a whole load of people around the world and looked at case studies of best practice, in a sense, of what people are doing in different countries in business English. I'm sure you've seen this book. It's been out for a couple of years now. If you haven't, then it's well worth looking at, I think. So when we start getting into the details of this, of course, every book, we're all working in different contexts, language schools, in-house, corporates, and so on. And these are very, very different. And this umbrella term, business English, sometimes doesn't do us any favors, because of course a course book might be perfect for a language school where somebody is going in and doing 40 hours a week, and maybe completely inappropriate for a corporate situation where they need very specific needs and very specific contexts. It might be very good for tertiary education in the university, but hopeless for one-to-one. So it's when you see on Facebook, you see somebody saying, what's the best business English course book? That is actually a bit of a meaningless statement, obviously, because there is no best. Every course book has pros and cons, depending on the context you're using it in. Here's I very often ask my learners, my students, my clients to just write down how they use English during the day. And this is a German manager in an IT department. And look how he uses English, because this is actually what perhaps we should be thinking about when we're in the classroom. Answering an email question via chat, daily status meeting with a Dutch developer team, writing a solution for an incident, so closing the ticket, 5-minute support on the phone with a Belgian, coordinating some steps with Slovenia, telephone conference, a roadmap meeting with a Dutch developer team, sending a mail. You can see the sorts of variety of things. Now, ideally, if we're looking for a course book for somebody like this, we should actually be looking for these sort of genres and these sorts of language use in our course books. Otherwise, perhaps that course book is not appropriate at all. And this is where we start begin to struggle, because a course book is very, very, very general. It has to be in order to make money, to sell enough. But you can see the needs of individuals is very, very specific. Here's a Chinese manager. And think about the similarities and differences as I go through this one. Look, responding to mails, okay, pretty similar. Meeting with a group of colleagues, message presented in English, conversation in Mandarin. Attending meeting with a group of colleagues face-to-face, mainly discussion in Mandarin. Attending department meeting or gathering, fully in Mandarin. Okay, that's in his own language. Helping a leader to address technical problems via email, all in English. Discussing a task with one manager via phone call, message in English, conversation in Mandarin. Searching for information on a website, all in English. You can see, and this you can find most people, most business people in the world are doing this all the time. They spend 5 minutes in English, 5 mintes in the local language, 5 minutes in English, 5 minutes in the local language. And there's very often this mixture where they're having to explain things to colleagues, where they have to analyze something in one language and then discuss it in another language, and so on. This is the mediation, of course, which is very clearly done in the CFR. But I wonder how much of this we actually see in our course books. it's well known that this is a standard need of business English people around the world. But, are we familiar with anything in our course books which allows us to practice this sort of language behavior in the classroom? I'm not so sure. So here's this idea of genre. And just to remind you what I mean by genre, what we're talking about is some sort of text, spoken or written. And every text is in a sense static and stable. You know that an email to a hotel is to book a room. Actually, we don't write emails to book rooms anymore, but if an email about a meeting might have similarities to another email about meetings. And so there's static elements in that sort of genre, and we can teach that. But then there's also the contextual stuff, the stuff that changes in each email, the situation, which is much more dynamic. And this is what makes each email unique. Each email is different. So you have an email which has certain characteristics which you can clearly identify, or it doesn't have to be written, it can be spoken, it can be opening a meeting. Sometimes it will always have these sorts of characteristics, but it will also have something to do with specific context. And our job, in many would argue, certainly in the research world, is to say, look, our job is to make sure that somebody who's participating in these genres and who does not have a pattern of an understanding of when they have to stick to the right characteristics and when they can be flexible, they will be the outsider. And our job is to stop them being an outsider. This is a quote by Flowerdew I use all the time because I really think it hits exactly what our job is. We want to stop our learners coming across as incompetent. And to do that, they have to be able to use these genres in the right way, which means that teaching people how to use certain sentences in emails is not doing them any favors if they cannot understand when you can be flexible with these phrases, and so on and so on. So how is business English or workplace English, workplace language different from other types of language? In other words, what is it that makes a business English course book? What sort of language is there which is different to what you might find in a general course book? Why aren't we using the same books? Well, of course, workplace languages tends to be goal-oriented. People are there because they have a goal. They have a reason to be there. It uses quite specific lexis to do with the local context, to do with the company, to do with the project, to do with whatever they're talking about. Although it's interesting that as we'll see later, most business English conversations don't have a lot of big topic words like nouns and so on. They tend to be much more action oriented because people in the room know what they're talking about. So all the stuff we teach, nouns to talk about various things, that's not actually what's in a business English conversation generally. They tend to be asymmetrical in that one person in the conversation will have more power than somebody else in the conversation. So it might be a client talking to a supplier. The client probably has more power. It might be a department head talking to employees, whatever it is. It's not a balanced conversation. It's not the same type of English as you see when a group of friends gets together and has a discussion. Of course, it's a lingua franca in the sense that it's used by people all over the world in order to do business. It's a common language. It's genre-based, as we've just seen, and that's actually quite critical that it's genre-based, as we'll carry on. I'll keep bringing up this word genre. It's context-specific, of course. It's work-related, and there's this social, personal element. So we have this small talk and getting to know you and relationship building on one side, but you're doing that because it's work-related. And some conversations are more work-related, and some conversations are more to do with social and personal and relationship building. It requires expertise. If you don't have the expertise to do the job, then you wouldn't be there. So you can't just pull somebody in from outside and say, okay, you're now part of this department, and here's the English you need. You have to know what you're doing. And of course, there's a lot of research to suggest that workplace language is actually quite vague, very, very often. People don't like to be specific unless they have to. So people generally give options. When is the project going to be finished? Oh, around September, maybe. They don't say at 6 o'clock on the 12th of September. And there's lots of research which shows that vague language is actually an important part, and teaching our students how to use vague language is an important part of language for the workplace. Another concept, which I'm sure everybody in this audience has come across, but has been very, very useful over the years, is this idea of community of practice. Wenger, but various other people have spoken about it. And this idea that when people come together, they start using language in a certain way. And then outsiders who want to join that group have to learn to use that language too. And it's exactly the same when we form a classroom. When a class, at the beginning, everybody's strangers, but after 6 months, there's insider jokes, insider language, and somebody coming in new into that class won't necessarily understand everything that's going on. So community of practice is absolutely key, because what we're trying to do as teachers, just as much as giving people access to these genres and when to be flexible with a genre, is this idea that we're trying to help them to become full members of community of practice. The problem is we are not members of that community of practice ourselves. And so nobody in the room is actually part of that community of practice necessarily. And that's one of the big challenges. This is what Janet Holmes and Stubbs say about community practice quite recently. No pre-packaged course, so we're talking about materials like we're examining, can hope to prepare people for such communicative diversity and associated challenges. So when you move into a community of practice, and you're in various communities of practice, we're not all in one, we're in all of us are members of different communities of practice. So how do we teach people? Well, they suggest rather people need assistance in developing their observational and analytical skills so that they can identify for themselves the appropriate ways of interacting in their specific community of practice on any particular occasion. In other words, what they're saying is don't teach the language because we don't know it, and it's too difficult as outsiders to get hold of that, but teach people and train people to have the skills in order so that they can adapt and learn how to become part of a community of practice. I'll leave it to you to decide how well or how good course books are at developing these sorts of skills. And so when we come into our classroom, when we come into our course, what we're doing is we're finding the gap always at the beginning, this needs analysis. There's continuation from beginner to advanced. First of all, we have to see where they need to be. So we go and do our needs analysis. We speak to other people in the company. We speak to the learners themselves. We speak to other insiders. There's a whole range of things where we find out what the target discourse is. Once we find out what the target is, then of course we can find out where they are now. You can't find that out until you know where they need to be, because of course it's related. That forms a training gap, and then the training gap is what we try and close as business English teachers. And that this has been standard for a number of years. There's nothing new or exciting about this. But of course, what we're talking about today is about how good our course books are at helping us close this gap. How good are they at identifying where our students need to be and where they are now, or how flexible are they so that we can use the course book as a resource and adapt it to our own particular situation, our own particular teaching situation. This is the $64,000 question, I guess. And of course, again, here, what we're talking about, where they need to be, is just as much pre-experience groups who have to be given an insight, shown what the world of business is and the world of conducting business is, not the world of reading about business, not the world of, oh, let's watch a CNN article and discuss it, but the world of doing business is, just as much as in a very context-specific in-company type of course. And then once we've decided on what we need to do, we choose our methodology, or we might be given a methodology, but basically, most researchers say, yes, there are three things we need to learn any language. We need to have some sort of language input. Without that, there's not going to be any language learning. There's got to be some sort of practice at some stage. So people have got to be given the chance to practice. It might be that they get the input via the practice, but you need both those elements. And then, of course, people need to want to learn a language. If they don't want to learn a language, then they're not going to learn a language. And there's plenty of cases of people living in countries for 20, 30 years and never learning the language because they're not motivated to, they don't need to. So these three elements are fairly key to learning a language. And then the methodology, we might have a PPP, very, very common. this is pretty much how course books are laid out, where they present some sort of text, some sort of video, some sort of situation, and then there's some sort of practice activities, and it might be very tightly controlled and then less controlled later. And then we go on to the third P, and we give them some sort of task which relates to the language they've just been practicing. PPP is been around for forever and is going to stay around, I think, in course books, because this is how course books effectively, or many of them, work. The other alternative, of course, is to do what's called task-based learning, where you give people a task related to your needs analysis, so related to what they have to be able to do. And then once they've done the task, they get feedback. And they get feedback in two forms in task-based learning: language feedback, which generally comes from the teacher, from the trainer, from us, and task feedback. In other words, how well did they do the task? And that might be from the other people in the room. It might come from the teacher, but the teacher is generally not an expert in that particular task. It might come from outsiders who are brought into the class to give this sort of feedback. So, for example, if you're talking about a task of simulating a negotiation, or maybe doing a presentation, then the teacher might give language feedback. You could have said this might have been better, and so on. And then the others might come in and say, yes, but our clients don't need this sort of content, and this is not the way to excite our clients, and this is not the way to win a negotiation with these people, because the contract on page 4 says this, stuff which the teacher can't necessarily do. So task-based learning, very, very common in business English settings. Not so sure how much it's part and parcel of course books, because course books are not necessarily this context specific. They have to be more general. They come in from the outside. And then, of course, there's blended learning solutions, which is face-to-face plus distance equals blended learning. And nowadays, the middle distance online has become a lot bigger than it ever used to be. And some people think, well, yes, we'll stay like this for a long time. And some people think, well, no, as soon as lockdown is over and we can get back together, then people want face-to-face. We don't know. We don't know how it's going to pan out over the next 2 or 3 years. So I said we'd talk about a little bit about the background of what people are thinking about in terms of what makes good practice in business English teaching, and in terms of what the researchers are saying. Well, maybe we should be thinking about this and this, because this is what our research says. Let's look very quickly at a checklist. If you want to evaluate a course book yourself, or if you want to look at some materials, these are the sorts of things you might look at. Now, there are lots and lots of books on this. Don't get me wrong. This is not me inventing the checklist, and I'm sure half of these books are on your shelves already. There's some really excellent books out there which give you these sorts of checklists. But this is the checklist I came up with after having read through the latest research and looked at the survey of the materials I looked at. Is the course book needs-based? If it's not going to target people's needs, either as a resource or as a basis for a curriculum, or then chuck it out the window. It's not going to be useful to you. Does it reflect the authentic language and genres which your students have to read? And in fact, if you read the survey, you'll find that some course books look a lot at written text in terms of emails and reports and so on. Other course books say, no, business English is about newspaper articles. We use the Financial Times, we use the whatever, and they bring in business-related articles from outside. You have to decide which is the language, which is the genre that your students need to be able to handle. Do they need to be able to write emails, or do they need to be able to read the language of newspaper articles, and so on? Is it relevant to what they're talking about? And this is very interesting because, of course, a lot of course books have management level content. And again, I've commented on this in the survey. And this isn't necessarily relevant to a lot of the people we meet in companies where the managers aren't in the classroom. The managers can already speak English. That's why they're managers. And it's the next level, it's the lower level of employees in the company who are doing language training. And they're not necessarily the ones who are going to be interested in Maslow's theories of motivation and all the rest of the nice stuff, which you might see on an MBA course, but you won't necessarily need if you're at clerical level or a team assistant or secretarial level or equivalent. So again, that's something you have to look at. I think this whole idea of intertextuality is something which we need to focus on. Traditionally, many course books talked about phrases and learning lexis, learning the language, and that's all very well. But unless we can try and pack it into the same sort of ways people use language in the real world, so it's not just a case of learning the phrases, but how can I use these phrases and which phrases are most appropriate for this context and which ones are more appropriate for this context, then there's not much point. And this is one of the things which has come out more and more in recent research. Of course, methodology, depending on the country you're in, depending on where you're working, there may be on your institution, on your company, there may be quite different ideas about what is appropriate methodology and what isn't, and what people are willing to pay for and what they're not. It's very nice for people to say, oh, I don't use course books, I develop my own materials, but that is hugely expensive in terms of time and effort and expertise. Course books are fantastic, very cheap solution for bringing in very nice resources into the classroom, which if you had to replicate them yourself in the same quality, professional quality, might actually be a very difficult game. So if you don't use course books, but you just bring in stuff off the internet, then that's not necessarily doing a better job. What we're doing, if we're doing our own materials, is bringing in authentic materials, tailor-making materials, big expensive job. And then the last two, flexibility and ease of use, I think are really important. If we're using a course book to set the syllabus, to set the curriculum, so we say, okay, these people are B1, this is roughly the right language level, we'll start at Unit 1, and we'll just go through the course book over 6 months, over a year. That works very well for thousands and thousands of classes all around the world, and you cover set language, it's been designed, and it's all very nice. But a lot of people want to dip into a course book. And so if you're at that, if you need your course book to be more of a resource rather than your curriculum, then you need it to be flexible. You need to be able to dip in and out of it. You need to be able to say, okay, I just want to use this article, and can I go into the teacher's book? And yes, there's excellent additional activities which I can use just with this text, but I don't have time to do the whole 2-page spread. And so on. Is it flexible enough, or does everything do you have to do every exercise, every activity in order for it to make sense? Can you do activity number 8 by skipping 5, 6, and 7, or do you have to do 5, 6, and 7 before number 8? This is what I mean by flexibility. And then the last thing, ease of use. I think this has become a big problem. I know when I started looking at some of these books, and I had a whole pile of them, and they all come with as a big package with CDs and internet websites and this and this and this, and actually getting your hand on what is available and where it all is and what you can use and what you can't use and so on. It actually requires quite a lot of effort and time investment to get into and learn one of these packages. And of course, some of the publishers actually have different versions of the same book. So you might be buying the B1 book, but there are different versions of the B1 book, depending on how much the client wants to spend, how much of it you want to use on the internet, and so on. So ease of use, I think, is an important factor. We're in this, of course, to teach people English, but we're also in it, we've got limited time and limited resources ourselves. And a good course book, I think, should be easy to use, and a lot of them aren't. So what sort of discrepancies did I find when I worked through my pile of course books? Well, one of the things, of course, is and I've hinted at this already, are we talking about the language of about business or the language of doing business? And they are very different things. This has been argued about in business English circles for years and years, of course, it's nothing new. But the language of talking about business is the top half. It's interviews with business people, it's academic articles, it's the stuff you might find in an MBA course, watching the news. But that's talking about business. That's not the same as the doing business, which is the bottom half. Writing an email, doing a presentation, reading a contract and discussing it with somebody, having meetings with suppliers and so on. And the language used in the top half and the bottom half is actually very different. Almut Koster makes a very good point in this wonderful book. If you're going to buy one book about business English and what the language is like, this is one of the ones you should really consider. But look, she says, in writing or talking about business, very often for public consumption, the emphasis will often be on success and positive developments. Whereas when we're actually engaged in doing business, the focus is often on problem solving of some kind. So it's not only that the topics are different and what you're using language for, but the type of language is very different. If you look at an earnings call, for example, very common on the internet, where companies just say, yes, this is how well we're doing, and this is why you should buy more shares or invest in our stock. It's all about success and positive, and there's very little about problem solving. There's very little about doing business. It's all about talking about business, and it's a very, very different, very, very different. Problem solving language is a different thing, and that's what meetings are about. You get together and you try and solve a problem. There may be some discussion about why you want to buy our product, but after that, it's about solving the problem of getting the product to you, meeting delivery deadlines, changing the contract, and all the rest of it. Problem solving. I think that's actually quite a useful insight, I think, which she's produced there. Of course, we all know and love the whole debate about English as a lingua franca, which has been around for the last few years. Now, course books traditionally have been language models. That's one of the main things they're there for. You've got listening exercises where you can listen and listen to different varieties of English, or you can listen to English. But which model do we choose? It used to be easy. We used to use British English, and then we used to use American English, and blah, blah, blah. But actually, now that English is used all around the world, and there are so many varieties of English, and it's so context specific, maybe focusing on one or two main models is no longer where we need to be. Certainly, I've worked with Germans who don't have anything to do with Britain or America, and they need Indian varieties of English. And you try and find course books which practice Indian varieties of English, and yet you can find thousands of business people in Germany. I'm sure it's the same in Poland, where British English isn't causing a problem. Indian English is, because they're just not used to it. It's a different variety, it uses slightly different words, and so on. And then, of course, there's the whole argument about English as a lingua franca in terms of what are we teaching? Are we teaching accommodation skills? This idea that we need to teach people to lower the level of their English when they're speaking to people who are less competent than them. How much training do we do with that? Very, very important. If you're sending a highly trained engineer to a country where he's going to be briefing the workers whose English isn't very good. Are we talking about code switching, this changing from language to language and register to register that we looked at with that Chinese example a few moments ago? And what about error correction? How do we decide what is an error and what isn't an error? If we're looking at ELF, what works is generally seen as okay. And we need to focus on stuff which doesn't work, as opposed to what is an error according to some standard which you've pulled in from the outside. So this whole ELF stuff is really quite critical, I think, in course books. It hasn't been solved. And if we get into BELF, business English as a lingua franca, or more commonly nowadays known as English as a business lingua franca, the B is the hard skills, this stuff that you need to know about marketing. If you're in a marketing department, you need to have the skills. It's not only about soft skills. You can't just go into a company and have soft skills and you're going to work fine in every department. They hire you because you're an engineer. Hopefully you'll have the soft skills as well. So maybe they'll be looking at both. But if you're not an engineer, you can have all the soft skills in the world. They won't let you anywhere near that turbine and talk about it with the client. And so this whole idea of business knowledge and how do we bring that into our classroom? Business knowledge, knowing about business, because that's actually what business people do. They have expertise. This word authentic comes up again and again and again. But let's look at the language which we're looking at in course books. Here's a quick question. So you have to wake up now and answer this question. How common is the first conditional in real world? Not in course books, in real world. Is it A, B, or C? Just type A, B, or C. Or you don't have to say anything. A, C, A, B, B. That's the hedging. You see, that's the vague answers. Yeah. it's very, very tricky because we as teachers see this over and over and over again in course books. And yet the research is actually very, very clear. The first conditional is actually quite rare, and there's all sorts of traditional reasons why we divide conditionals into these three conditionals. But actually, as soon as you start examining conditionals, those aren't necessarily the ones that people use. They're not necessarily the ones that people need to use. And maybe we're doing a disservice. And there's lots of examples of, I wouldn't like to say old-fashioned grammar, but certain ways of thinking about grammar which have been inherited and which stay in the course books forever and ever and ever, even though we know from research that they're not necessarily the best way of treating this sort of language. Tricky. Then there's parsnips. Parsnips is this idea that when a publisher produces a book, there are certain areas which tend to be left to one side because they could potentially cause conflict in a classroom situation, could potentially cause discussion. So politics, alcohol, religion, sex, and so on. You just don't put those into published course books. But here's an example of a course book I was involved in a few years ago, and it was for the oil industry, so it was an ESP book more than business English. And we were discussing pipeline inspection gauges, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Pipeline inspection gauge is basically a machine that drives up and down or goes up and down the big oil pipes. And you can see from the picture, it cleans, it scrapes the pipe as it goes along. And they call it pigs. In the industry, they're called pigs. And these pigs squeal as they go along metal to metal. They actually sound like squealing noises. And when you speak to engineers there, they say, yes, have you pigged the pipeline? Have you pigged it? Yes, we pigged it yesterday. No, we're going to pig it tomorrow. It's a verb, you know. And yet, when I tried to put this into a book, of course, the publisher said, well, we can't use the word pig because the oil industry is in the Middle East and people might be offended. And I could show that people in the Middle East actually use this word pig, because that's the technical word used by the professionals in the industry. But in the end, it was decided not to put the word into the book, and all the discussions had to be around pipeline inspection gauges. So have you used the pipeline inspection gauge yet, as opposed to have you pigged the pipeline? And this is where, well, what word was put then? They used the whole phrase pipeline inspection gauge rather than pig. And this is where parsnips and the whole idea of being careful with language, and you can't fault publishers for doing this because, of course, it could cause an international situation. But it is a problem if that's the language you're supposed to be teaching. So where are we now? Well, I think from what I found in my survey, many of the big publishers now have put in-company training and tertiary into one pack. Now, there was a recognition many years ago that they are different worlds. The needs of an 18, 19, 20-year-old at university is actually quite different to the needs of people in companies, and the sorts of activities and tasks are quite different. But to produce two books is a very expensive game, and so most of the big publishers produce this in one pack. And in fact, these course books now come as a package, so you can't operate with just the book. You have to buy all the bits and pieces, and you have to pay to access the website, and you have to pay to access the extra worksheets and so on. So that has evolved over the last few years. In the old days, I'm sure many of us will remember just going and having a book, maybe buy a cassette, and that was enough. You can't do that anymore. There's a lot more to these course books now. ESP books are pretty much dying out as compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago. And that's, again, for obvious reasons. ESP is very difficult to do when you don't know your room, when you don't know your students. It's very context specific, and they weren't selling. ESP books haven't been selling. And I mean, to give you an example, I worked in the oil industry in Germany for a year or two. And there are hundreds and hundreds of people working in the oil industry in Germany, but they're all working in the delivery of oil and the supply of oil. None of them have ever seen an oil rig and all the stuff you get in a English for the oil industry book. And this is part of the problem of the ESP industry, of course. What's interesting is that there are quite a few course books now which are not only in company and tertiary combined, but in company, tertiary, and adult. So they call it adult professional market now. I think OUP, for example, doesn't even have a business English section anymore. It's adult education. And again, this is a cost issue. You know, they're trying to make these books hit as many people as possible. So it's a massive, massive compromise. We can also talk about some of the technology. So a lot of these books now are designed for blended learning, for online delivery, for flipped classrooms. That's become fairly standard, where you can give people work to do outside the language classroom, and then they come back in and you do the activity based on work they've already done, rather than give them homework after the activity. Big data and learning analytics is really becoming big. It's difficult to find out what's going on here because people keep this sort of information to themselves. But big data, in other words, getting huge amounts of language data, how language is used in order to inform how your course book is written. Of course, it started a few years ago with corpus linguistics, but it's getting much, much bigger than that now. And a lot of the online, free online language learning apps, the reason they're free is that they're collecting data on how people in different countries and how learners in different contexts use language and where their mistakes are. And they're going to be producing the next generation of course books, which will be much more targeted. Learning analytics is this idea that we're trying to analyze how people learn. And here there are all sorts of issues. For example, when they start learning how students are doing and how they're not doing, and then they start seeing, well, which teacher made the students learn in this way and which teacher made the students learn in this way. And you start looking at issues of teacher accountability and how do we judge who is the best teacher using the data. And of course, that's a huge hot potato because teaching is not a science. Many would say it's an art. Yet big data and learning analytics will try and look at key criteria and say, okay, this one is better than this one, and we will go this way. Difficult. Big data, of course, is being used all the time in things like translation software, which is getting fantastic now. DeepL and Google Translate and so on are really useful tools for language learning, and they didn't even exist 10, 15 years ago. Not in the reliability that they have now, anyway. And then there's this automatic assessment and adaptive learning. So this idea that your students do the activities or the exercises online, and you get a quick email saying so many did this, and here are where most people had mistakes, and this didn't cause any mistakes, and so you can adapt the learning to suit what the data is showing you. So on one side, course books are very much a publisher-driven resource, but on the other side, this technology is driving the publishers as well. What is interesting, I think, is that most of the books are second and third editions. I think I found one or two books which were first editions in the last 10 years. It's too expensive to produce first editions, and nobody knows which way this is all going. What is certain to me is that although all the publishers say they're speaking to teachers, what they're producing, in fact, is huge compromises because it's too expensive to go down a very niche market. Where are we now? Well, this is a robot I met a few years ago when I was in Japan. These things, Pepper is around all over the world. There are thousands of these now. And they just move around and talk to you in the shop or in retail, in finance, in healthcare. They're the receptionist, maybe, when you go into a company. You can ask it questions, you can press the screen, and they're getting better and better all the time. Of course, these robots, they can translate. They speak 15 languages at the moment. Very accurate, so I can speak to it in English. It speaks back to me in English, and then it speaks to the next person in French, and so on and so on and so on. And this is where I think we're going with a lot of language learning, because these are actually sold already and are used already in universities all around the world and classrooms all around the world as teaching assistants. Kids love them because, of course, they're very patient. They smile at you, and if you make mistakes, they will not get upset. So these sorts of devices are going to become more and more popular, I think. I said at the beginning, it was like supermarket in the past where you could go along and pick a course book off the shelves. I think now it's much more complex than that. It's a lot more online. We're going into Amazon, we're going into Alibaba, we're going into things which don't even look anything like course books anymore, like Pepper, the robot. And I'm not sure really where we're going to. I actually wrote in the survey, this may be the last survey which looks at course books as course books, because I think these things are changing very, very fast. And we'll be using a lot different resources, or people will be using different resources in order to learn a language, never mind for people like us who are trying to help them learn. So there you are. You can get the slides, as I said, on my website, but the thing has been recorded, so you'll be able to watch it on YouTube if you've got really nothing else to do. If we've got 5 minutes left, so if you've got any questions or comments, I'd be very happy to see them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer. Wow, okay. So, Rob, there's also the social relationship context in business communication, tentative, assertive. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's all part of what this research is showing. You're absolutely right, Rob. Andre, by the way, Market Leader, the older editions are probably the better illustration of how not to write course books, I'm afraid. It simply goes the grain of what Evan is talking about. Yeah, I would agree. I think we've learned a lot. The newer versions don't exist anymore. You know, Business Partner is completely different approach to Market Leader. But Market Leader were first done in the 90s. So we're talking about 20, 25 years ago. And you're right. One of the reasons why course books are changing is because people are becoming more aware of the research and what has to be in these course books. So yeah, I take your point, Andre, completely. Alicia, hi, Alicia says, we've used in companies since I started. As for other series, we've changed basically because of new and more modern alternatives. Another one has been Market Leader. Then we moved from Business Basics through English 365. Wow, that's quite a while back, passing by others. The one series that normally works well and students do enjoy it is In Company now in the 3rd edition. That's why we've never stopped using it. Yes, and maybe in your context, it's fine. I've also spoken to people who say I can't use In Company because it's too... the language is too difficult at the certain grades, the certain language levels. So, as I said at the beginning, I think course books have different uses in different contexts, and there's no one course book which is better or worse. You have to decide. When I worked at Siemens many years ago, and we were buying thousands of course books every year for our courses, and it was time to choose new course books. We knew our target audience roughly. And we went into a hotel with a pile of course books, 5 trainers, and we sat there for 2 days in the hotel, and all we did was analyze all these course books in as much detail as possible and debate and discuss and argue with each other, and then come up with one which we thought would best meet the needs of our own learners. But it's never easy to choose course books. It's just that they save us a lot of time as teachers. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes. Okay. Hi, Jerry. Nice to see you. Many course books. Whoops. Where are we? It's my screen is scrolling all by itself. Many course books, says Jerry, have become obsolete because they refer to the pre-COVID world. Yes, you're right. This is always one of the issues with course books, that they're out of date before they even get printed. And maybe a good course book will be full of tasks which don't go out of date so fast, which are much more the resource rather than this is how business is. You're right. You're right. It's a tricky one. There's no answer to that, but I think you know that, Jerry, anyway. Let's see. What's the next one? Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Elena. Lucina, my observation, needs analysis should be ongoing. Not always the first choice is the best. You're absolutely right, Lucina. Needs analysis definitely ongoing. Absolutely, definitely ongoing. There's no way. You learn something every time you go into the classroom, every time you interact with a group of teachers, students, every time you interact with a client and they give you feedback, of course. And I don't really want to talk today about specific books, but if you download the survey, that is one of the books I looked at. Yeah, I think, to be honest, most of the 2nd, 3rd editions which are out there do the job very well. They've used feedback, they've they've got their methodology, they've decided what people want, and I think the business is an example of a very professionally put together course for some contexts. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Are there any others, Marcin? Here's Anya. The idea that some texts are positive and texts of doing a problem solving are a revelation. Well, Anya, if I can give you a revelation, then my work is done and I can sleep well tonight. So thank you very much for that comment. Yeah, Eleanor. Yeah, you mix it with Market Leader. There's so many good books. Hi, Oksana. Yeah, thank you. Am I currently writing any textbooks? Says Victoria. Yes, I've just been involved in some. We've finished a pack of 12 course books for the maritime industry in Asia. So it's being used all over Asia to teach maritime English. I'm doing a couple of projects in Europe at the moment, but they're sort of still a little bit quiet or not being discussed. They may never come to fruition, I guess. Thank you for the thank yous. Marcin and Lucina, over to you. That's my hour. Hi, Ricardo. Nice to see you.
Just the voice. Thank you very much. I will be the first one to speak, and then Martin will close the whole event. What I noticed, apart from lots of inspirational content in your webinar, is the fact that we've all had a lot of fun here with you. And fun is the long lost element in teaching.
Is that good or bad?
Yeah. Guess. The guess is yours. Okay, Martin, over to you.
Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Please remember that in a few next days, we're going to have the next webinar, which will be on grading versus ungrading by Willow Barnowski. So please take a look at our Facebook and come to our webpage to subscribe to our newsletter, and you will be informed of the next. It's PM. Yeah, we'll change it into 2030 then, and it's 15th March, not February. I do apologize. Sorry, guys. Anyway, just want to remind you that ITF Poland is celebrating 30 years of our helping and supporting teachers in Poland. So yes, that's hopefully March, of course. We do apologize for that. But celebrate with us and join our YouTube channel as well. You can find all the materials from Evan at his website, e4b.de. Thanks a lot, guys, and see you soon.